In the upcoming clip, Noam Chomsky will draw a contrast between James Madison, one of the architects of the U.S. Constitution, and the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. The central tenet of the disagreement is that Madison feared the tyranny of the majority. He believed that democracy should protect the rights of the wealthy minority from the interests of the less affluent majority. He advocated for a system that limited direct democratic participation, while Aristotle believed a true democracy should function to advance the common good of all citizens. He argued that the best way to prevent the majority from acting against the common good was to reduce inequality, essentially championing the concept of a welfare state. Now off to this wonderful clip, and following it will be Chomsky's leanings and his ideal democracy.
Madison pointed out that the British system would have problems if they transferred it over here, and that is because the United States, they did want to make it, he and the other founding fathers, as they're called, did want to make it a more participatory and democratic society. But he said a democratic society has a serious flaw. The flaw is that in a democratic society the people can participate. And he said, suppose this were to take place in England. Suppose, for example, in England, that they really allowed people to vote, which they didn't. He said, well, the first thing people would do would be to call for what we nowadays call agrarian reform. That is, they would call for changes in the land laws, which would grant more people access to the highly privatized and centralized land system. And that, land was a crucial part of the economy then. And he says, well, we obviously can't accept that. We don't want to have any system that will allow people to participate and infringe on the rights of private property and wealth. So therefore we have to be careful not to allow a democratic system in which things really function democratically. We have to design a system in which power is in the hands of the wealth of the nation, I'm quoting, the more capable set of men, those who are sympathetic with the rights of property. Okay, they must have the power, and the rest must be dispersed and factionalized in such a way that they don't really interfere with the rights of power. Actually, Madison, who is no fool, recognized that this problem was going to become greater as time went on. As he put it, if I can read my own notes, he said there's going to be an increase in the proportion of the population that labors under all the hardships of life and secretly sighs for a more equal distribution of its blessings. Okay, there's going to be an increase in that, and if those people really have an ability to participate, they're going to do things which will infringe on the right of private power and private property on the wealthy, and therefore we have to design the system so that doesn't happen. And indeed the system was designed so that that wouldn't happen. That was the role of the Senate, was to represent the wealth of the nation, and the role of the separation of powers, and so on and so forth. How will it function? You can argue. It's an interesting question, but it's worth noticing that this idea about the nature of democracy has a long, this problem in the nature of democracy, that namely if people can vote, they're going to vote in their own interests and infringe on the rights of private power and wealth. That insight goes way back. It goes back to the origins of political theory. So you read the first major book on political theory in something like our sense, Aristotle's Politics. That's a core question of Aristotle's politics. Aristotle distinguishes tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, and has a long, elaborate discussion of each, and favors democracy. He didn't think it was perfect, but he favored democracy as the best system. For him, a democracy was very straightforward. It meant a community of equals, or to be precise, free men who are equals. And that phrase, free men, is rather crucial, but put that aside for a moment. A community of free men who are equal and participatory. Unless it's equal, and they can't be seriously participatory, he noticed the same problem that Madison did. Exactly the same problem. He said, suppose that you did have a democracy where everyone participated, but you had radical inequality, so concentration of wealth. He said, well, then the poorer part of the population, which is the majority, will use their voting power for their own interests, to advance their own interests, instead of the common good of all. Okay, and the goal of a democracy for Aristotle was to advance the common good of all. But if you had inequality, radical inequality, well, yeah, the majority of the population would vote for their own interests. profits, which would not be the common good of all. So therefore, he had to do something about that. It's the same problem that Madison faced, exactly the same problem, but they reached opposite conclusions. Madison's conclusion was that we should reduce democracy so that you don't get the threat from the population. Aristotle's was the opposite. You should reduce inequality, so therefore the problem won't arise. And it'll be, you could have a real participatory democratic system. So Aristotle called for what we today would call a welfare state. He said that a democracy must be based on use of public revenues to ensure lasting prosperity for everyone. Welfare state, in other words. And then he describes in some detail how you could proceed to do that in Athens. Do it differently here, but the same kinds of questions. And then if everyone had moderate but sufficient income, you wouldn't have this problem that both he and Madison faced. But notice that their choices were radically different. One choice was to aim for equality and participation in democracy. The other, the one on which our country was founded, was to reduce the threat of democracy, maintain the inequality, and ensure that power remains in the Senate, the capable class of men, the wealthy part of the wealthy part of the society. That's now internationalized. So this huge financial capital that's flowing around the world is sometimes called by international economists a virtual Senate, meaning it has the power to ensure, if you really liberalize capital, to ensure that no country will be able to undertake social policies that strike at the interests of the wealthy. Because if any country moves in that direction, the capital quickly flows out of it and the country goes down the tube. So it's a virtual Senate, kind of a generalization of Madison's Senate. And the opposite of the Aristotelian conception of democracy is necessarily based on a welfare state and equality. To go back to that word free men, a democracy for Aristotle meant men, not women, and free, not slaves, or aliens. So it's a subpart of the population, but it's a little hard to dump on Aristotle for that, since given that those questions weren't even addressed, and badly addressed, until this century, and still are far from addressed. But that's a significant qualification. But the principles are there, and they come right up to the present. It's also been understood, by now and this battle, sort of struggle up and back between the two conceptions of democracy is a large part of modern history, major theme of modern history, runs right through the 19th century. It's hard to remember now, but in the 19th century, which was a rather anarchic period in the United States, it was quite generally assumed that you not only had to have an equal and participatory society, but that even wage labor was an intolerable infringement on human rights. That wasn't a radical position. That was the slogan of the Republican Party, for example. You could read it in the New York Times editorials in 1870. It was the slogan under which many Northern workers fought the Civil War. It was Abraham Lincoln's, position. Wage labor is not very different from chattel slavery. Because it's a fundamental infringement on rights. It was the major theme of the working class press, which was quite lively around this area, run by women from the farms and artisans and so on. Their position was, look, if you have a democracy, the people who work in the mills have to own them, and you have to move towards real participation and direct control and so on. And that remained major themes of perfectly mainstream U.S. thinking right up until the corporatization of America about 100 years ago, when corporations developed collectivist legal institutions, as they were called, which got enormous rights, the rights of persons, but in fact well beyond persons, because they're immortal and huge in comparison with persons. That was sharply attacked by conservatives, a breed that doesn't exist anymore, but did exist a century ago, people who really believed in classical liberal doctrines. They recognized that corporations were themselves a major attack on markets, and that Also an attack on the natural rights doctrines on which, conceptions of human rights and liberty were developed. That was a big change. And it's, again, not graven in stone. These were decisions.
Chomsky aligns closely with Aristotle's perspective. He critiques Madison's views, arguing that the U.S. constitutional system was designed to protect the interests of the wealthy elite at the expense of the common good. Chomsky believes this limitation undermines true democracy. Chomsky asserts that concentrated wealth and power create conditions where a minority can easily manipulate and control the democratic process for its own interests, rather than the benefit of the majority. Chomsky believes that reducing radical economic disparities is precondition for achieving a truly democratic system where all citizens' voices are equally valued. He advocates for a system where ordinary citizens have much more direct influence on decision-making processes, going beyond merely voting for representatives. Well, I hope you liked the video and give the channel a subscribe. Also, if you wish to join the channel as a member, it would be appreciated. Now, take care and bye-bye.